Hello, I'm Rex Schaldhaus, and today is Sunday, June 25th, 2023, because things on the internet seem to lose their date references. In May and June of 2023, my wife and I decided that we were going to take our first long vacation since 1985. We drove from San Diego County to British Columbia, got on a Disney cruise with the Disney Wonder to Alaska, which was fantastic. One of the things we did up in Vancouver, British Columbia, quite by mistake, unplanned, we were coming home from the zoo, Greater Vancouver Zoo, and I looked to my left, saw what looked like a control tower, and just to the right of that, saw an S2, a Stoof, which is an airplane I'd flown in the Navy, parked there, and decided I was going to go back and investigate because we had time, and we found the Canadian Museum of Flight, and spent about 2.5, 3 hours there. Really excited my wife on that, let me tell you. I love airplanes, she tolerates them. A nice museum, not extremely big, nice museum, and we're going to take you on a video visit of the Canadian Museum of Flight. So let's move on. Life for any museum piece is tough, and what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to try and give you the signage as shown here, and then the pictures of the aircraft. And there was some signage that I photoed that I didn't have pictures, that there were no airplanes for. They were gone, they were out for repair, they were elsewhere for whatever. So the Lockheed CF-104D, which is a two-seater, actually built in the United States for the Canadian Air Force, is the first aircraft that you walk out the entrance door to see, and you can sit in it. And this is really my only disappointment in the museum. As the signage says, this aircraft was later a training aid at a maintenance facility, and it is just tore up. If I had lived closer and could volunteer, I'd clean this thing up so that people could actually sit in it and enjoy it. And the Starfighter is just a fantastic airplane. It has a phenomenal history. As described, it is basically a jet engine with a human sitting in front of it. It's super fast. The next airplane that I rolled into was the Beech 18, as I know it, the Beech Expediter. U.S. Navy called it, the U.S. military called it C-45, and it was open for touring, so I climbed up in the cockpit. I've got a couple of flights in a Beech 18. I never even put them in my logbook because, quite honestly, the pilot I was flying with was drunk and the airplane was in gross shape, and I wanted no record of it. The cockpit was in good shape. The cockpit on this particular one was actually in better shape than the one I flew. There were a lot of engines around the museum. The vast majority of them had super signage, and I love engines. I'm an airframe power plant mechanic certificated by the FAA. They don't certify mechanics. They don't certify pilots or flight instructors. They certificate them. Between working on an airframe, working on an engine, I'd rather work on an engine. There were a number of engines around the museum. The signage was good, so this one here is a Pratt & Whitney R1830 Twin Wasp, a really super airplane with a lot of engine with a lot of history behind it. It flew the DC-3s, a number of other aircraft, and then things just show up that you wonder, how'd they get them, or why are they here, and they are aviation related. So here's the gearbox out of a Sikorsky S-55. The S-55 is the H-19 for the Army, which is the Chickasaw. The Army names helos after Indian tribes. This is a Korean War, early Vietnam era helicopter, and was flown by a number of the U.S. military very successfully. A super helo, and that is a radial engine mounted in the front of it. It's at a slope. The drive shaft comes between the pilot and the co-pilot to the transmission, which is immediately behind the pilot and the co-pilot, between them and behind them, kind of like in their back seat. And then the vertical shaft goes to the main rotor, and an auxiliary shaft goes to the tail rotor. Interesting concept. Step over to another engine, the Wright R1300, super engine with a lot of history behind it. And this engine was actually the engine that powered the H-19 or Sikorsky S-55. So if you want to see what's in the nose section of that, and that blister opens for easy access, and this is a helicopter engine. You can see that by the big fan mounted on the front of it. Then we find this guy here, the Canadian Quickie 1. It was a home built, really nice. These aircraft pretty popular around the US. If you look at this guy though, the prop spins counterclockwise. By the signage, it's a modified Onan 2-cylinder opposed engine. Okay. Interesting aircraft. Weird configuration. Step off to the Avro CF-100 Chinook, and this is the airplane. This airplane, late 1950s, early 1960s for development. It's a big airplane. Joyce is standing there in the photo. It's an era when jet engines to produce a lot of power had to be really big before we got up to the era that we're in now, where small engines produce a lot of power. Step up to the Handley Page Hampton, which is a World War II bomber, and really, really nicely kept up and maintained. I was impressed. It's a big airplane. And for twin engines, and the Brits seem to like the twin fins on a number of their aircraft, which is okay. I kind of like them too. They look good. Beech 18, Cessna Skymaster, the de Havilland DH-100 Vampire. When you see de Havilland, if it's DH, it was built in the UK. If it's DHC, it's de Havilland Canada. It was built in Canada. The Vampire is one of the mid to late 1940s aircraft. Kind of interesting. The Brits go back to their two-tail system. A lot of these were sold off to the civilian market. Really nicely kept up and protected for some reason. Not sure why, but appreciate the fact that they were trying to protect it. The museum has a beautiful Canadair CT-114 Tudor, and it's in snowbird colors. Kind of interesting because the U.S. military's flight demonstration teams seem to use aircraft with a lot of power to demonstrate their skill and ability, whereas the Canadians, the snowbirds, use basically normal powered airplanes and then a whole lot of finesse. This is a really nice display. Stepped over to another engine, Continental R670. Found this one kind of interesting because I'd seen this one before. I know a little bit about it. It's a frequent engine in a number of the early aircraft 1930s stuff, but also in tanks during World War II. So that was pretty interesting. The military liked U.S. military liked using radial engines in tanks because they do not require radiators. Then we come up to the 0470. Now, I've flown the 0470 in a number of different aircraft. It's a nice engine. It's a good engine. It's reliable. Really cool. And you kind of wonder how these engines end up here. Most of them are obviously donated, and they may be at the end of their service life to the point that something's happened to them, maybe a prop strike so they can't be turned back in. Maybe they had a oil malfunction, so the aircraft, the components can't be retrofitted, repaired, whatever. Kind of interesting, but they're on display, so they aren't going to waste. The Rolls-Royce Derwent 1. I have never heard of this engine before. It looks like a J33 centrifugal compressor, individual burner cans going back to the power turbine. Kind of cool. Worked on J33 and Lockheed T33, which you're going to see later. This engine goes back into the late 1940s, early 1950s for development. Another engine I'd never heard of before, the Napier Eland, developed as a turboprop. It's a big engine, really impressive. So it was on display, took a look at it. It impressed me. I love engines, as I said. If I have a choice between working on an airframe or working on an engine, I'll take engine any day of the week. Pratt & Whitney R1830, which is two of their engines literally bolted back to back. It was on a custom, especially made block, so it wasn't just two engines bolted together. But the 1830 flew on a number of notable airplanes, the B-24, the PBY. If you're a fan of the DC-3s, they wore the Twin West C-47s, a number of engines. And the Navy liked the radials because they didn't have to worry about the cooling system. The Air Force preferred liquid-cooled engines so they could keep the frontal area narrow for visibility and whatever else. Found another engine that had never been seen, didn't know existed before. It's this PZL AI-14RA. It's a Russian engine that, according to the signage, is still in production or may have just come out of production for a long time. So it's got a long history with it. The prop that's sitting next to it, that's from the prop strike, is not associated with this engine. This kind of looked like a clone of maybe a U.S. engine, which was not uncommon for the Russians. You can't sue the Russians for anything they do. An engine with history, the Ranger 440. It's an inverted engine. It powered a number of airplanes, and aircraft manufacturers, designers loved it because it was upside down. So the pistons were underneath the crankshaft. This allowed the propeller to be relatively high, makes the landing gear on the aircraft a little bit shorter. The pilot has good visibility. The issues with it is they are high oil consumption, and you have to crank them by hand over several times to make sure that the oil hasn't settled down into the compression area of the piston, because if it has and you try to start the engine, you'll ruin the engine. Another engine I worked on, and this was on the Vickers Viscount, and the Rolls-Royce Dart 506. Really a super notable engine, developed in, I believe, the late 1940s into the mid 1950s on a number of aircraft, and it spins its prop the wrong way, so to speak, counterclockwise as you sit in the cockpit looking forward. There were a number of models positioned in various places. These were hung in the overheads, really nicely detailed. These were not kits bought in the dime store for $1.99. Here's a S2 in the center of this picture, toward the left-hand side, sitting on top of the case. An S2, which I flew. I assume that those are firefighting colors because of the wingtips and the fuselage. Kind of interesting, kind of fun. Good, really good models all over the place. De Havilland Beaver on floats, exquisitely detailed. And here's a couple of cases with tons of really well detailed models in them. I was impressed. Moving back to real aircraft, the De Havilland DH-82C Tiger Moth, and it had information about the engine as well. The docent that we were with said that it was airworthy, that it was undergoing some annual inspections and repairs, and that they hope to have it back in the air in 3 to 6 months. Had nice information about it. Gypsy Major is the engine that's in this aircraft. I didn't notice this until I was making the video. Next to the Tiger Moth is a Benson gyrocopter. These were real popular in the 1960s. You bought them as a kit. They had a small engine that attached to a propeller behind the pilot. You ran it down the runway. The air would start the rotors spinning. When they developed enough lift, you could lift off the ground and fly around. You had to maintain forward motion. You could do a very short hover because it was the forward motion that caused that generated the rotation of the main rotor. There were versions that had powered rotors. This one does not appear to be that way. Then we have the Waco AQC6, and beautifully done. I was told this was airworthy as well, and that it did fly on occasion. Nice docent. We had a docent with us probably 25% of the time. Very knowledgeable, very nice guy to work with. Stearman A75N1, and it's Canadian registration. Stearman's did a lot of things along the way, and trained a lot of pilots, did a lot of crop dusting work, whatever else. Once again, we were told that this aircraft was going to be returned to flight status sometime in the near future. Looks like they have a fair amount of work accomplished and quite a bit of work ahead of them. The Fleet 16B Finch Mark II, beautifully restored, well kept. I was told this one was actually airworthy as well, and did fly in air shows and in the local area. Then the Bolus Dragonfly BB1. Now this one caught me by surprise. This is a home built and never really went anywhere, but it does have beautiful workmanship in a laminated fuselage section and retractable gear. That was interesting. Somebody put a lot of work into this thing. And the Waco, which is an airplane of somewhat notable history, beautiful restoration, fantastic work. Somebody's maintained these airplanes really well. Not sure if that was airworthy or not, but it sure looks like it. Northrop Shelduck. I'll buy that. Target drone. Had seen these before, and they were pretty popular. The object of these is actually not to hit the drone, but to get close to it. You kind of want to fire around it so that you can use the drone on another day. And if you hit it, you end up buying drinks. So the Strushin ultralight helicopter, interesting history, and it talks about it in the display, in the signage. Built by Strusin and built from a collage of parts, a mini helicopter, and it says it may not have ever flown, but it did do air taxi tests or hover tests, which means it has flown. Interesting design. Wonder if it would have flown successfully out of ground effect. I wish the guy had tried it. And an airplane that I have a history with, the Canadair Lockheed T-33. We had these at Southern Illinois University, where I got my A&P, and we worked on these engines. They're J-33s in the U.S. military. Interesting airplane, very heavily built. It was the basis, it was the trainer of the F-80, which is the single-seat version. And there's some interesting design features. There's what's called dump doors on the back of this thing. And J-33, similar to that centrifugal compressor engine that we saw earlier. North American Harvard Mark IIB. There were a couple of versions of this, one for the Army Air Corps, one for the Navy, and they were slightly different. It was airworthy. It was on the flight line. They do fly it regularly. These are fairly common at air shows, but you sure don't want to ding them up. And as you look at the sky, it was starting to get dark and threatening. We come up with a replica here. They talk about it. It's the SE-5A. Somebody's doing a lot of work trying to build this aircraft. I commend people who can do really good airframe work. I'm okay at it. I prefer engines. This is one of the engines that I'd never heard of before. And it was obviously a maintenance or pilot trainer because it was cutaways. It had cutaways. It's a big jet engine. An engine to produce this much power would be a third the size today. Individual burner cans going into the power turbine. Numerous cutaways to show how it works, how it all fits together, which means it's really interesting, really cool. I like when they do cutaway engines, so you can explain how it works. The de Havilland Goblin, which is an engine. It's another centrifugal compressor engine, and there were only a couple of I only had a couple of good shots for some reason. The Kenner B5 is an engine of history note. There's special clubs for people who have flown these, and a lot of very early aircraft. There were Kenner 5s engines, and if you've flown one, you were a notable person. They were in the 20s and 30s. Back into engines, and a number of us just believe in Pratt & Whitney's, just believe in radials. The R2800, which is a double wasp, it's 2 banks of cylinders. As I said before, if you haven't flown a radial engine, you have missed an opportunity. They are just fantastic. And this particular display had a lot of information about the engine itself, which was like really cool. A Rolls-Royce Merlin, which is a V12. I've heard a number of people at air shows tell me that this is a V16. That's popular myth. And the Packard engine, which is also shown here at the museum, is not an exact duplicate of the Rolls-Royce Merlin. But the Packard engine is up at the museum too. It's also a V12. That was our 2.5 hours or so at the Canadian Museum of Flight right outside of Vancouver, British Columbia. I thought it was a great tour. I thought the docent was really good. The signage was good. A few of the signs were for aircraft that weren't there. Some of the aircraft didn't have signs, but it was really good. And they do have a general aviation ramp where they can park aircraft, and it was well worth it. I really enjoyed being there. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it.